In the summer of 1847, the small town of Kulp Peppa, Virginia, witnessed something so disturbing that local authorities sealed every record, burned witness testimonies, and swore the surviving residents to silence until their deaths. 27 people disappeared without a trace over the course of just 6 weeks. The only clues left behind were strange symbols carved into oak trees, personal belongings arranged in perfect geometric patterns, and 2 names whispered in fear by those who dared to speak: Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe, twin brothers, aged 27, who had returned to their hometown after a decade-long absence with knowledge that no God-fearing man should possess. Tonight, using recently discovered courthouse documents that somehow escaped the Great Fire of 1851, we'll uncover the truth about what really happened in Culpa that summer and why the United States government has kept this file classified for over 175 years. Before we continue with the story of the Crowe twins and their reign of terror in Culpeper County, what makes this case even more chilling is that it occurred during one of the most documented periods in American history. Yet, somehow these events have been completely erased from official records. Culpeper, Virginia, in 1847, was a prosperous farming community of approximately 800 souls, nestled in the rolling hills between the Rappahannock River and the Blue Ridge Mountains. The town had thrived since its founding in 1759, its fertile soil producing tobacco, corn, and wheat that fed much of the surrounding counties. Main Street bustled with activity as merchants, farmers, and craftsmen conducted their daily business under the watchful eye of the courthouse clock tower, a symbol of order and justice that had stood for nearly a century. The community was tight-knit, as rural Virginia towns often were, with families who had lived side by side for generations. Church attendance on Sundays was mandatory by social custom, if not by law, and Reverend Marcus Holloway's sermons at the Culpeper Baptist Church were attended by nearly everyone in town. The Reverend, a stern but fair man in his 50s, had served the community for over 20 years and was considered not just a spiritual leader, but a pillar of moral guidance. Among the most respected families in Culpa were the Crowes, whose patriarch, Jeremiah Crowe, had been one of the town's founding merchants. The family owned the largest general store on Main Street, as well as several hundred acres of prime farmland. Jeremiah had married young to a woman named Rebecca Thorne, daughter of a prominent Richmond family, and their union was blessed with twin sons in the winter of 1820. Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe were identical in appearance, but vastly different in temperament from their earliest days. Ezekiel, born first by mere minutes, displayed an unsettling intensity even as a child. His pale blue eyes seemed to pierce through whoever he looked at, and he rarely smiled. Nathaniel, by contrast, was charming and personable, quick with a joke or kind word, though those who knew him well noticed something calculating behind his easy smile. The boys were inseparable, often seen whispering to each other in what their parents assumed was the private language common among twins. As they grew into young men, both twins displayed remarkable intelligence. They excelled in their studies under the local schoolmaster, mastering not only reading, writing, and arithmetic, but showing unusual aptitude for subjects like natural philosophy, anatomy, and what was then called experimental science. Their father, proud of their academic achievements, often spoke of sending them to the University of Virginia when they came of age. However, in the spring of 1837, when the twins were 17, a scandal rocked the Crowe household. Sarah Wickham, the 16-year-old daughter of a local farmer, was found dead in the woods outside town. Her body bore strange marks that the local doctor, Dr. Edmund Parrish, could not explain. More troubling still, several townspeople reported seeing the Crowe twins in the vicinity of where Sarah's body was discovered, though no formal accusations were ever made. Within weeks of Sarah's death, Jeremiah Crowe announced that his sons would be leaving Culpeper to pursue advanced studies with a distant relative in Boston. The twins departed on a warm May morning in 1837, and for 10 years, Culper heard nothing from Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe. Their parents received occasional letters postmarked from various cities, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, but the contents were never shared with neighbors or friends. The decade that followed was peaceful in Culpeper. The town continued to grow modestly. New families arrived, children were born, and the memory of the Crowe twins faded into the background of daily life. Dr. Parrish retired and was replaced by a younger physician, Dr. Thomas Fairfax, who brought modern medical knowledge from his training in Richmond. The railroad had reached neighboring counties, bringing new prosperity and connecting Culper to the wider world. But on June 15, 1847, everything changed when two figures stepped off the afternoon stagecoach on Main Street. The men were tall and lean, dressed in fine black suits that spoke of city sophistication. Their pale blue eyes surveyed the familiar streets of their childhood, with expressions that chilled the handful of townspeople who recognized them. After 10 years, Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe had returned to Culpeper. The brothers' return was marked by an immediate sense of unease that seemed to settle over the town like morning fog. They took rooms at the Culpeper Inn, operated by Mrs. Martha Henley, a widow who had known the boys since they were children. Mrs. Henley later told authorities that the twins spoke very little during their stay, often retiring to their rooms immediately after supper, where strange odor would sometimes emanate through the floorboards. Smells she described as reminiscent of her late husband's veterinary practice, but more acrid and unsettling. Their first official act was to visit the courthouse, to claim their inheritance. Their father had died 3 years prior from consumption, and their mother had followed him to the grave just months later. The family property, including the general store and farmland, had been held in trust by the county, awaiting the twins' return. County Clerk Benjamin Fletcher, who processed their claim, noted in his diary that both men had changed dramatically from the boys he remembered. Their hands, he wrote, were stained with what appeared to be chemical burns, and they carried themselves with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Within days of settling their affairs, the twins began renovating their childhood home, which sat on a hill overlooking the town. Wagons arrived from Richmond, carrying crates and barrels, whose contents they unloaded themselves, refusing all offers of help from curious neighbors. The deliveries continued for weeks. Scientific instruments, chemicals, books, and materials that no one in Culpeper could identify. Local children reported seeing lights burning in the house's upper windows at all hours, and a constant thin stream of smoke rising from what had once been the kitchen chimney. The twins' behavior in town was courteous, but distant. They attended church services, though Reverend Holloway noted that they never participated in communion, and often seemed to be studying the congregation rather than listening to his sermons. They conducted business at local establishments, always paying in gold coins rather than the paper currency common at the time, and speaking to merchants with a politeness that somehow felt more threatening than genuine warmth. It was young Timothy Crawford, aged 12, who first noticed the disappearances. Timothy worked part-time at Hamilton's livery stable, caring for horses and maintaining equipment. His job required him to know the routines of regular customers, and he possessed the keen, observational skills common to intelligent children. On July 2, 1847, Timothy approached his employer, Mr. James Hamilton, with a troubling observation. "Mr. Hamilton," the boy said, "ain't it strange that Mrs. Kemp hasn't been by for her usual Thursday riding lesson? And Mr. Dobson was supposed to pick up his mare 2 days ago, but his stall still occupied." James Hamilton, a practical man who had run the livery for 15 years, initially dismissed the boy's concerns. People changed their routines, he reasoned. Perhaps Mrs. Ilalanina Kemp had decided to skip her weekly ride, and maybe Farmer Daniel Dobson had decided to leave his horse stabled a few extra days while he tended to other business. But as Timothy continued to point out absences, The widow Patterson, missing her Sunday visit to her husband's grave. Merchant Jacob Stone, failing to appear for his regular poker game at the inn. The school teacher, Miss Catherine Brennan, not opening the schoolhouse for 3 consecutive days. Hamilton began to pay closer attention. The pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. One by one, reliable members of the community were simply vanishing from their normal routines. Their homes remained untouched, their belongings exactly as they had left them, but the people themselves were nowhere to be found. When Hamilton finally approached Sheriff William Torres about his concerns, the sheriff's initial response was skepticism. "People travel, James," Sheriff Torres said, leaning back in his chair at the courthouse. "Summer's the time for visiting family, conducting business in other towns. I can't investigate every person who decides to take a trip without announcing it to the whole community." But Sheriff Torres's dismissiveness began to waver when his own deputy Marcus Glenn failed to report for duty on July 8th. Deputy Glenn was a punctual man, a former soldier who ran his life by military precision. When Torres went to Glenn's boarding house, he found the deputy's room exactly as it had been left. Bed made, uniform pressed, and hanging in the wardrobe, service revolver still in its holster on the desk. The only unusual detail was a piece of paper on the floor, partially hidden under the bed. The paper bore a symbol drawn in what appeared to be charcoal, a circle containing interlocking triangles with strange markings along the perimeter that resembled no alphabet Torres recognized. The symbol filled him with an inexplicable sense of dread, though he couldn't explain why. He folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket, deciding to investigate further before taking any official action. That evening, Torres made his rounds through town with more attention than usual. Main Street was eerily quiet for a summer evening. Several businesses that should have been open had their shutters drawn, and the usual sounds of community life, children playing, neighbors chatting on porches. The clatter of dinner preparations seemed muted and subdued. As he walked past the Crowe house on the hill, Torres noticed something that made his blood run cold. Silhouetted against the lighted windows were 2 figures standing perfectly still and appearing to watch the town below. Even from a distance, their stillness was unnatural. No movement, no casual shifting of weight, just absolute motionless observation. When Torres blinked and looked again, the figures were gone, but the lights in the upper windows continued to burn throughout the night. The next morning brought news that would shatter any remaining doubt about the nature of Culper's crisis. Mrs. Henley discovered that 3 of her inn's guests, a traveling merchant from Fredericksburg, a circuit preacher heading to Charlottesville, and a young couple on their honeymoon, had vanished from their rooms overnight. Their luggage remained untouched, their beds appeared, slept in, but the guests themselves were nowhere to be found. The only trace of their presence was that same mysterious symbol, this time carved into the wooden frame of each empty room's window. As news of the disappearances spread through Culper, the community's initial confusion gave way to a creeping terror that seemed to seep into every conversation. Every sideways glance, every hesitant step down previously familiar streets. Sheriff Torres called an emergency town meeting for July 12th, hoping to address the growing panic and organize some form of systematic response to what was clearly becoming a crisis. The meeting was held in the largest space available, the sanctuary of the Culpa Baptist Church. Reverend Holloway opened the gathering with a prayer for guidance and protection, his usually strong voice trembling slightly as he besieged the Almighty to watch over their troubled community. Nearly 200 townspeople packed the wooden pews, their faces reflecting the fear and uncertainty that had settled over Culpeper like a suffocating blanket. Sheriff Torres stood before the congregation, his badge catching the lamplight as he attempted to present what few facts he had gathered. 23 people had now been confirmed missing, ranging in age from 16 to 68, representing every social class and occupation in town. The missing included farmers, merchants, craftsmen, housewives, and even his own deputy. In every case, their personal belongings remained undisturbed, suggesting that whatever had happened to them had occurred suddenly and without warning. "What troubles me most," Torres told the assembled crowd, "is the complete absence of any signs of struggle or violence. These people didn't pack bags, didn't leave notes for family members, didn't close their businesses or make arrangements for their affairs. It's as if they simply stopped existing in the middle of their normal lives." From the back of the church, a voice called out with a question that many had been thinking, but few had dared to voice. "Sheriff, what about the Crowe twins? They return after 10 years, and suddenly people start disappearing. That can't be a coincidence." A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation, but Torres held up his hand for silence. "Now I understand why folks might think that way, but we can't go making accusations without evidence. The Crowe boys have every right to return to their hometown, and far as I know, they haven't broken any laws." But even as he spoke the words, Torres felt doubt gnawing at his conviction. He had indeed investigated the twins' activities since their return, and what he had discovered was troubling, if not definitively criminal. They had purchased unusual quantities of chemicals from suppliers in Richmond, compounds used in embalming, preserving specimens, and experimental research. They had also acquired surgical instruments, anatomical charts, and scientific equipment that seemed far beyond what any normal citizen might need. More disturbing still were the reports from townspeople who lived near the Crowe property. Mrs. Sarah Dalton, whose farm bordered the Crowe land, reported seeing lights moving through the woods at night, not the steady glow of lanterns, but dancing, flickering illumination that seemed to move with purpose through the trees. Her husband Robert had found several dead animals on their property, deer, rabbits, even their own livestock, arranged in those same geometric patterns that were becoming all too familiar throughout Kulp Peppa. The meeting concluded with the formation of a volunteer patrol system, with groups of men taking turns, watching the streets throughout the night. Families were advised to stay together, to account for each other's whereabouts at all times, and to report any unusual activity to the sheriff immediately. But even these precautions felt inadequate against a threat that seemed to operate by rules no one understood. As the townspeople filed out of the church into the humid July evening, many cast nervous glances toward the hill, where the Crows stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. The upper windows glowed with their usual yellow light, and once again, those same two motionless figures could be seen observing the town below. Dr. Thomas Fairfax, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, approached Sheriff Torres as the crowd dispersed. The young physician's face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he pulled a leather portfolio from his medical bag. "Sheriff," Dr. Fairfax said quietly, "there's something I need to show you. Something I discovered while reviewing my predecessor's files." The portfolio contained Dr. Edmund Parrish's private notes from 1837, including detailed observations about Sarah Wickham's death that had never been shared with authorities. According to Parrish's carefully documented examination, Sarah's body had shown signs of what he called experimental manipulation, incisions made with surgical precision, organs removed and replaced in ways that served no medical or practical purpose, and evidence of chemical preservation techniques applied post-mortem. Most chilling of all was Parrish's final entry about the case. "I have examined many bodies in my 40 years of practice, but never have I seen evidence of such methodical and purposeful experimentation on a human being. The work shows knowledge of anatomy and chemistry far beyond what any layman should possess. Whatever was done to this poor girl was done by someone with extensive training in the medical arts and a complete absence of human compassion. I fear for what might happen if such a person were to continue their studies unchecked." Dr. Fairfax closed the portfolio and looked directly at Torres. "Sheriff, I believe Sarah Wickham was murdered by the Crowe twins 10 years ago, and I believe they spent the past decade learning how to perfect their techniques. If I'm right about what they're doing to our missing townspeople. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were too horrible to speak aloud, yet too probable to ignore. The volunteer patrols that had been organized after the town meeting proved to be both a blessing and a curse. While they provided some comfort to frightened families, they also resulted in the discovery of evidence that made Culpeper's situation even more terrifying than anyone had imagined. On the night of July 15th, a patrol group consisting of farmers Robert Dalton, Henry Vance, and merchant Samuel Reed discovered what would later be called the arrangement site. In a clearing approximately half a mile from the Crowe property, the clearing, which had been used for years by local children as a natural playground, had been transformed into something that defied rational explanation. 23 personal items, a bonnet, a pocket watch, a wedding ring, a leather-bound Bible, various other belongings clearly taken from the missing towns. People had been arranged in a perfect spiral pattern around a central circle of stones. Each item was placed with mathematical precision, the distances between them measured to the inch. In the center of the stone circle, symbols had been carved into the earth itself, the same interlocking triangular design that had been found in the inn rooms, but larger and more complex, incorporating additional markings that seemed to form a kind of written language. But the most disturbing discovery was not the arrangement itself, but what surrounded it. The trees bordering the clearing showed signs of recent activity. Bark stripped away in specific patterns, branches removed to create sightlines, and carved symbols that seemed to form a larger pattern when viewed from the center of the clearing. The entire site had clearly been designed with a specific purpose in mind, though that purpose remained terrifyingly unclear. Samuel Reed, who had served as a surveyor before becoming a merchant, spent several minutes examining the arrangement with his professional eye for precision and measurement. What he discovered filled him with dread that he would carry for the rest of his life. "Gentlemen," Reed said to his companions, his voice barely above a whisper, "this isn't random. Every measurement here is exact. The spiral follows a mathematical progression. The stones are placed according to geometric principles. And those symbols, they're not just random marks. This is a design created by someone with advanced knowledge of mathematics and engineering." The patrol immediately reported their discovery to Sheriff Torres, who arrived at the site with Dr. Fairfax and Reverend Holloway just before dawn. The three men stood in stunned silence as they absorbed the implications of what they were seeing. This was not the work of madmen or random criminals, but evidence of a systematic and carefully planned operation being conducted with scientific precision. Reverend Holloway, despite his lifetime of theological study and pastoral experience, found himself struggling to interpret what he witnessed through any framework his faith provided. "I've read about pagan rituals and ancient practices," he told Torres, "but this seems to combine those old beliefs with modern knowledge in ways that shouldn't be possible." Dr. Fairfax knelt beside the carved symbols, pulling out a magnifying glass to examine their construction more closely. "These incisions were made with surgical instruments," he reported. "The depth and precision are consistent with medical tools, not farming implements or household knives. And look at this." He pointed to what appeared to be dark stains around several of the symbols. "This appears to be dried blood, but it's been treated with some kind of preservative. It should have decomposed by now in this heat and humidity, but it's been chemically stabilized." As the three men documented the site, they began to notice additional details that made their discoveries even more unsettling. The arrangement had been constructed to be visible from the upper windows of the Crowe house, suggesting that it was designed for observation from that specific vantage point. Moreover, the sightlines created by the modified trees formed a pattern that drew the eye inevitably toward the center of the clearing, creating a hypnotic effect that made it difficult to look away. Sheriff Torres made the decision to place a watch on the clearing, hoping to observe anyone who might return to the site. He personally volunteered for the first shift, positioning himself in a concealed location approximately 50 yards away, with a clear view of the arrangement. His vigil began at sunset on July 16th, and what he witnessed that night would haunt him until his dying day. At exactly midnight, two figures emerged from the woods surrounding the clearing. Even in the moonlight, Torres immediately recognized the distinctive silhouettes of Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe. The brothers moved with purposeful precision, each carrying what appeared to be a leather satchel and a dark lantern that provided minimal illumination. The twins spent nearly 2 hours in the clearing working with the silent coordination that only lifelong partners could achieve. They moved items within the spiral arrangement, made additional carvings in the earth, and performed actions that Torres could not clearly observe from his concealed position. Most disturbing of all, they appeared to be conducting some form of ceremony or ritual, standing at specific positions around the circle and making gestures that suggested practiced familiarity with whatever process they were following. Torres desperately wanted to intervene, to confront the brothers and demand answers about the missing townspeople. But something about their behavior filled him with a paralyzing dread. There was something inhuman about their movements, a mechanical precision that suggested they were following instructions or procedures learned through extensive practice. The sheriff found himself unable to move, frozen in his hiding place like a rabbit caught in the gaze of predators. When the twins finally departed, they left behind evidence that confirmed Torres's worst suspicions. The arrangement had been modified again, with several items moved to new positions and fresh symbols carved into the earth. More chilling still, one additional personal item had been added to the spiral. Deputy Marcus Glenn's badge, positioned with the same mathematical precision as all the other objects. Torres remained hidden until dawn, afraid to approach the clearing while darkness might conceal the twins' return. When he finally emerged from his concealment, he discovered something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Carved into a tree, directly above his hiding place, was a message clearly intended for him. "We know you're watching. Join us willingly, or join the others permanently." And the sheriff realized that his investigation had put him directly in the brothers' crosshairs, and that time was running out for both himself and the remaining residents of Culper. Sheriff Torres's discovery at the clearing forced him to confront a terrible reality. The Crowe twins were not only responsible for the disappearances, but they were operating with the level of planning and preparation that suggested their activities extended far beyond simple murder. The mathematical precision of their arrangements, the systematic nature of their victim selection, and their apparent ability to predict and counter his investigation efforts pointed to something much more sinister than random violence. Torres spent the morning of July 17th examining every piece of evidence he had collected, trying to identify patterns that might help him understand the twins' ultimate objective. The symbols found at various sites throughout town appeared to follow a consistent design language, suggesting they were part of a larger system or code. The victims represented a cross-section of Culp's population, but when Torres mapped their homes and regular activities, he discovered something that chilled him to the bone. The missing people's locations formed a pattern that mirrored the arrangement in the clearing, with their homes and businesses positioned around the town in the same spiral formation that had been created with their personal belongings. It was as if the entire community of Culpa had been mapped and analyzed, with specific individuals selected to fulfill roles in some grand design that encompassed the entire town. Dr. Fairfax arrived at the sheriff's office mid-morning with news that confirmed Torres's growing fears. During the night, 3 more townspeople had vanished. Mrs. Helen Crawford, Timothy's mother, blacksmith George Patterson, and elderly widow Jane Carpenter. Their disappearances followed the same pattern. No signs of struggle, personal belongings left untouched, and that familiar symbol carved somewhere in their vicinity. Sheriff Dr. T. Fairfax said, his medical training allowing him to maintain composure, even while discussing the unthinkable. "I've been studying the pattern of disappearances and I believe I've identified the selection criteria. The victims aren't random. They represent specific segments of our community's social and economic structure. It's as if someone is deliberately removing key individuals to destabilize our entire social order. Torres looked up from the map he had been studying, marked with red pins indicating the locations of missing people. What do you mean? Look at who's been taken, Fairfax explained, pulling out his own notes. We've lost our deputy, our school teacher, several prominent merchants, key farmers whose crops feed much of the county, the woman who runs our telegraph office, the man who maintains our water system. These aren't random victims. They're the people whose absence will cause maximum disruption to our community's ability to function. The doctor's observation sent a chill through Torres as he realized the implications. You're saying they're systematically destroying the town's infrastructure by removing essential people. Exactly. And if my theory is correct, they're not finished. Based on the pattern, I believe they'll continue taking people until Culpeper can no longer function as a community. The question is why. Their discussion was interrupted by young Timothy Crawford, who burst through the sheriff's office door with tears streaming down his face and terror in his eyes. The 12-year-old boy was nearly hysterical as he tried to explain what he had witnessed the previous night. Sheriff, I saw them take my mother. Timothy gasped between sobs. I was supposed to be asleep, but I heard voices outside. When I looked out my window, I saw two men carrying her out of our house. She wasn't fighting or screaming. She was walking with them, but her eyes looked empty, like she was sleepwalking. Torres knelt down to the boy's eye level, trying to remain calm while extracting crucial information. Timothy, can you describe the men? Did you see their faces? They were dressed in black suits, and they moved together like they shared the same thoughts. One of them looked back at our house before they disappeared into the woods, and I swear he smiled right at my window like he knew I was watching. It was the scariest thing I ever seen. Sheriff, what did they do to my mother? Dr. Fairfax and Torres exchanged glances over the boy's head, both thinking the same terrible thought. If the twins were somehow controlling their victims, making them cooperate willingly in their own disappearance, it explained the lack of struggle or evidence of force at any of the crime scenes. Torres arranged for Timothy to stay with the Hamilton family at the livery stable, then immediately organized a search party to scour the woods around the Crawford property. What they discovered there would prove to be the breakthrough he had been desperately seeking, though it came at a cost that would haunt him forever. The search party, consisting of Torres, Dr. Fairfax, and 6 armed townsmen, followed a trail of broken branches and disturbed earth that led from the Crawford house deep into the forest surrounding Culpeper. The trail was almost too obvious, as if it had been left intentionally for them to follow. But Torres had run out of options for conventional investigation methods. After nearly 2 hours of tracking through increasingly dense woodland, the party emerged into a large natural clearing that none of them had known existed, despite living in the area their entire lives. What they found there defied every assumption they had made about the nature of the disappearances and the twins' motivations. The clearing contained a complex of structures that had been constructed with materials and techniques that seemed impossible for the remote location. Several wooden buildings arranged in a precise, geometric pattern housed what appeared to be an elaborate laboratory and research facility. Tables lined with scientific instruments, shelves containing hundreds of glass containers filled with unidentifiable substances, and detailed anatomical charts covering every available wall surface created an environment that belonged more in a major city's medical college than in the Virginia wilderness. But it was the central building that contained the most horrifying discovery. Inside what appeared to be a crude but functional surgical theater, the search party found evidence of the missing townspeople's fate. 23 wooden tables, each bearing restraining devices and stained with substances that Dr. Fairfax immediately recognized as blood and other Bodily fluids were arranged in the same spiral pattern that had appeared throughout the investigation. On shelves lining the walls, glass containers held what appeared to be human organs preserved in chemical solutions. Detailed notes written in 2 different handwritings that matched samples from the twins' correspondence documented procedures and experiments that read like a nightmare combination of medical research and systematic torture. Dr. Fairfax, despite his medical training and familiarity with human anatomy, became violently ill as he examined the contents of the laboratory. "Sheriff," he managed to say, between waves of nausea, "these aren't just murder victims. The twins have been conducting experimental procedures on living human beings. This is torture disguised as scientific research." Torres felt his world tilting as he absorbed the magnitude of what they had discovered. The Crowe twins hadn't simply killed 23 people. They had systematically tortured and experimented on them while they were still alive, treating human beings like laboratory animals, in service of some twisted form of research. But even worse than what they had found was what was missing from the laboratory. Despite evidence that 23 people had been brought to this location, they found no bodies, no remains, no indication of what had ultimately happened to the victims after the experiments had been completed. As the search party stood in stunned horror, trying to process the implications of their discovery, they heard the sound that every one of them had been dreading throughout their investigation. The distinctive sound of footsteps approaching through the forest, moving with the mechanical precision they had learned to associate with Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe. The twins had returned to their laboratory, and the search party was trapped in the clearing with nowhere to run. The footsteps grew closer with measured precision, each step falling in perfect rhythm with its companion, creating an eerie synchronization that seemed to echo through the trees surrounding the clearing. Sheriff Torres quickly motioned for his men to take defensive positions behind the laboratory buildings, though he knew their hiding places would provide little protection if the twins were armed, or had other means of controlling their victims. Dr. Fairfax, still struggling with nausea from his examination of the surgical theater, pressed himself against the wall beside Torres and whispered urgently, "Sheriff, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Those notes I found, they describe techniques for using chemical compounds to control human behavior. If the twins have perfected those methods—" Torres cut him off with a sharp gesture as 2 figures emerged from the terrain into the clearing. In daylight, without the concealment of darkness or distance, Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe appeared even more unsettling than Torres had imagined. Both men were tall and gaunt, their pale skin seeming to absorb rather than reflect the summer sunlight. Their identical black suits were immaculate despite their journey through the forest, and they moved with a coordination that suggested a shared consciousness rather than individual thought. But it was their eyes that truly chilled Torres to his core. The pale blue irises he remembered from their childhood had darkened to an almost colorless gray, and there was no warmth or humanity in their gaze. They looked at the world around them with the detached interest of scientists observing specimens, as if every living thing existed solely for their analysis and potential experimentation. Ezekiel, the twin who had always been the more intense of the pair, spoke first, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing with unnatural projection. "Sheriff Torres, Dr. Fairfax, and gentlemen of Culpeper, we knew you would eventually find our research facility. In fact, we've been guiding you here for quite some time," Nathaniel continued seamlessly, as if completing his brother's thought. "Your investigation has been most useful to us. You've helped identify the remaining subjects. We need to complete our work, and your predictable behavior has allowed us to prepare for this final phase." Torres stepped out from behind his concealment, his service revolver drawn, but trembling slightly in his grip. "Where are they? Where are the people you took from our town?" The twins exchanged a look that might have been amusement in normal human beings, but appeared more like scientific curiosity on their inhuman features. Ezekiel gestured toward the surgical theater with casual indifference. "They served their purpose in our research. Each subject contributed valuable data to our understanding of human physiology, psychology, and the mechanisms by which consciousness can be controlled and modified. "You're talking about torture and murder," Dr. Fairfax called out, his medical oath compelling him to speak despite his terror. "Those were human beings, not laboratory animals." Nathaniel tilted his head with mechanical precision, as if considering the doctor's words from a purely academic perspective. "Your emotional attachment to individual specimens is understandable, but scientifically counterproductive. Our decade of study in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York provided us with theoretical knowledge, but practical application required subjects who would not be missed by authorities with sufficient resources to interfere with our work. Culper was perfect for our needs," Ezekiel added. "An isolated community, minimal contact with outside law enforcement, and a population trusting enough to be easily acquired. We've documented the complete process of human experimentation from initial capture through final disposition, creating a comprehensive methodology that will revolutionize our understanding of human nature." Torres felt sick as he realized the twins were discussing the systematic murder of his friends and neighbors with the same detached interest that a farmer might discuss crop rotation techniques. "You're insane. Both of you are completely insane." "Insanity implies irrationality," Nathaniel replied calmly. "Our work has been entirely systematic and logical. We identified research objectives, developed methodologies, acquired necessary subjects, conducted controlled experiments, and documented our results. The only difference between our research and that conducted at medical colleges is the willingness to extend our studies beyond conventional ethical limitations." Dr. Fairfax, drawing on his medical training to maintain some semblance of scientific dialogue, asked the question that had been haunting him since discovering the laboratory. "What happened to the bodies? Where are the remains of the people you experimented on?" The twins' synchronized smile was perhaps the most horrifying thing Torres had witnessed in his entire investigation. Ezekiel gestured toward a series of large glass containers along one wall of the clearing that the search party had not yet examined closely. "Waste not, want not," he said with chilling casualness. "Human tissue, when properly preserved and processed, provides excellent material for extended research. We've developed techniques for maintaining specimen viability far beyond conventional methods." Torres felt his stomach lurch as he understood the implication. The twins hadn't just killed their victims. They had found ways to preserve and continue experimenting on their remains, treating human beings like scientific specimens to be catalogued and stored for future study. "But our research phase is now complete," Nathaniel announced, pulling a leather journal from his coat pocket. "We have documented sufficient data to publish our findings, though we suspect the current scientific establishment lacks the vision to appreciate our methodological innovations." Ezekiel nodded in perfect synchronization with his brother, "which brings us to the final phase of our Culper project. You see, Sheriff Torres, we require witnesses to validate our work. Your investigation, your discoveries, your testimony will provide the credibility our research needs to gain acceptance in academic circles." "I'll never help you," Torres said, though his voice lacked conviction. Something about the twins' calm confidence suggested they had already accounted for his resistance. "Oh, but you will," Nathaniel replied, reaching into his own pocket to withdraw a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. "Our experiments have produced several breakthrough discoveries in the field of chemical behavior modification. This particular compound induces complete compliance while maintaining consciousness and memory formation. Subjects remain fully aware of their actions, but lose all capacity for resistance or independent decision-making." Dr. Fairfax recognized the implications immediately. "That's what you used on the missing people. You didn't kidnap them. You drugged them into compliance." "Precisely," Ezekiel confirmed. "Much more efficient than physical force." and it eliminates the messy complications of unwilling subjects during experimental procedures. A small injection, and even the most strong-willed individual becomes perfectly cooperative. Torres realized with growing horror that the twins intended to use their chemical compound to force him and his men to become willing participants in whatever final phase they had planned. But before he could formulate a response, Nathaniel made an announcement that changed everything. "However, we've encountered an unexpected complication in our research timeline," Nathaniel said, his mechanical voice taking on what might have been frustration in a normal person. "Our chemical supplies are running low, and our most recent batch of test subjects proved insufficient for completing our final experiments." Ezekiel's colorless eyes fixed on Torres with predatory intensity. "We require additional specimens to validate our conclusions. Specifically, we need subjects with strong wills and leadership capabilities. Law enforcement personnel and medical professionals provide ideal psychological profiles for our remaining research objectives." Torres felt the trap closing around him as he realized the twins hadn't just discovered his investigation. They had been manipulating it from the beginning, using his predictable behavior to lead him and his most capable allies directly into their hands. "You planned this," he said, the pieces finally falling into place. The obvious trail, the arrangement in the clearing, even young Timothy finding us. "You orchestrated everything to bring us here." Naturally, the twins replied in perfect unison, their synchronized speech creating an effect that seemed to bypass rational thought and strike directly at primal fears buried deep in the human psyche. But even as Torres felt despair settling over him like a suffocating blanket, he noticed something that gave him a spark of hope. The twins' laboratory, despite its sophistication, had been constructed hastily and with materials that were available locally. The buildings were wooden. The equipment was arranged for functionality rather than defense. And most importantly, the twins themselves appeared to rely entirely on their chemical compounds and psychological manipulation rather than physical strength or weapons. Torres caught Dr. Fairfax's eye and saw that the physician had reached the same conclusion. If they could avoid being injected with the compliance drug, they might have a chance to fight back against their captives. The sheriff made his decision with the desperate clarity that comes only in moments of absolute crisis. Instead of continuing the conversation that was clearly proceeding according to the twins' plan, he suddenly raised his revolver and fired directly at the glass containers lining the laboratory walls. The effect was immediate and devastating. Decades of preserved specimens, experimental compounds, and research materials erupted in a cascade of shattered glass and chemical reactions. Acrid smoke began billowing from the mixture of compounds, now spreading across the laboratory floor, and several small fires ignited where incompatible chemicals had combined. "Run!" Torres shouted to his men, but he needn't have bothered. The search party was already scattering toward the Terran, driven by instincts older than civilization, to flee from the unnatural horror they had witnessed. But even as Torres turned to follow his men, he heard something that froze his blood, the sound of the twins laughing. Not the unhinged cackle of madmen, but the satisfied chuckle of scientists whose experiment had proceeded exactly according to plan. "Excellent, Sheriff." Torres, Ezekiel called after him as the clearing filled with toxic smoke. "Your predictable response has provided us with the final data point we needed. The psychological profile of authority figures under extreme stress is now complete." Nathaniel's voice carried clearly through the chaos. "Phase 1 of the Culpeper project is concluded. Phase 2 will commence in our next location with improved methodologies based on everything we've learned here." Torres stumbled through the forest, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had heard. The twins weren't just conducting random experiments, they were perfecting techniques that they planned to implement elsewhere, using Culpeper as a testing ground for methods they would apply to other communities. But the most terrifying realization came as he burst from the Terran and saw the town of Kulp Peppa spread out in the valley below. Rising from multiple locations throughout the community were thin columns of smoke, and even from a distance, he could see figures moving through the streets with the same mechanical precision he had learned to associate with the twins' influence. The chemical compound they had used to control their victims wasn't just being applied to individuals. Somehow they had found a way to distribute it throughout the entire town. Sheriff Torres raced down the hillside toward Culpeper with his heart pounding and his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what was unfolding before him. The smoke rising from various points throughout the town wasn't coming from random fires, but from specific locations: the church, the courthouse, the schoolhouse, and several private residences. Each smoke column rose straight into the still summer air with unnatural uniformity, suggesting that whatever was burning had been carefully planned and coordinated. As he reached the outskirts of town, Torres encountered Dr. Fairfax, who had taken a different route through the forest and arrived several minutes earlier. The physician's face was pale with shock as he grabbed Torres's arm. "Sheriff, something's happened to the people," Fairfax gasped, still breathing heavily from his desperate flight through the woods. "I've seen at least 30 townspeople, but they're all behaving strangely. They're moving in formations, working together on tasks, but they're not talking to each other. It's like they're all following the same unspoken instructions." Torres pulled out his spyglass and surveyed Main Street from their concealed position behind Hamilton's livery stable. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about the twins' capabilities and their true objectives for Culp. The remaining townspeople were indeed moving with mechanical coordination, but they weren't acting like prisoners or victims. Instead, they appeared to be participating willingly in some kind of organized activity. Groups of residents were systematically removing items from buildings and arranging them in the street according to patterns that Torres recognized from the clearing. The same geometric formations that had appeared throughout the investigation. Mrs. Henley from the inn was working alongside Reverend Holloway to arrange furniture and personal belongings in precise spiral patterns. Merchant Samuel Reed was directing other townspeople in the placement of items with the same mathematical precision he had observed in the forest clearing. Even young Timothy Crawford, who Torres had left in the care of the Hamilton family just hours earlier, was participating in the activity with the blank expression and mechanical movements that characterized all the affected residents there. Not being forced, Torres realized with growing horror, they're cooperating because they want to. The twins have found a way to make them believe this is their own idea. Dr. Fairfax nodded grimly as he observed the scene through his own field glasses. It's more sophisticated than simple chemical compliance. They've somehow altered the townspeople's fundamental motivations and decision-making processes. Look at their faces. They appear satisfied, even happy with what they're doing. Indeed, the affected residents showed no signs of distress or resistance. They worked with the focused contentment of people engaged in meaningful labor, as if arranging their community's possessions in occult patterns was the most natural and important task they could imagine. But even more disturbing than the town's people's behavior was the gradual revelation of the pattern they were creating. As Torres watched from his concealed position, he began to understand that the entire town of Culpeper was being transformed into a massive version of the arrangements they had discovered throughout their investigation. Streets were being cleared to create signs, buildings were being modified to serve as observation points, and personal belongings from every household were being incorporated into a geometric design that encompassed the entire community. "Sheriff," Dr. Fairfax whispered urgently, "look at the courthouse clock tower." Torres directed his spyglass toward the town's most prominent landmark and immediately saw what had captured the doctor's attention. Two familiar figures stood at the top of the tower, silhouetted against the afternoon sky as they observed the transformation of their hometown. Even from a distance, their perfectly synchronized posture and movements were unmistakable. Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe had not only escaped the chaos at their laboratory, but had somehow made their way back to town ahead of the search party, and implemented what appeared to be the final phase of their mysterious project. As Torres watched in fascination and horror, one of the twins, he couldn't distinguish which, at this distance, raised what appeared to be a telescope or surveying instrument, and began making calculations based on the arrangements being created in the streets below. The other twin was writing in a journal documenting the process, with the same scientific precision they had applied to their human experiments. They're treating the entire town like a laboratory. Torres realized every person, every building, every street is part of some massive experiment they're conducting. Dr. Fairfax lowered his field glasses and turned to Torres with an expression of grim determination. "Sheriff, we have to stop this. I don't know what they're ultimately trying to accomplish, but if they've perfected techniques for controlling entire communities, they won't stop with Colonel Pepper. They'll move on to larger towns, cities, maybe even attempt to influence government officials or military personnel." Torres felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he realized that his failure to stop the twins in Culpeper could have consequences far beyond his small community. If Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe had indeed developed methods for mass psychological manipulation, they possessed capabilities that could threaten the stability of entire regions, perhaps even the nation itself. But even as he contemplated the broader implications of the twins' work, Torres noticed something that gave him hope for a solution. The townspeople's mechanical behavior, while disturbing, appeared to follow predictable patterns. They responded to the twins' influence, but they weren't armed or hostile. Moreover, their altered state seemed to require ongoing direction from the brothers in the clock tower. "Dr. Fairfax," Torres said, formulating a desperate plan. "What would happen if we could separate the twins from the townspeople? Would the effects of their chemical compounds wear off naturally?" The physician considered the question with his characteristic scientific precision. "Based on what I observed in their laboratory notes, their behavior modification techniques appear to require periodic reinforcement. If we could disrupt their ability to maintain control over the affected population." He didn't need to finish the thought. Both men understood that their only chance of saving Culpeper lay in somehow neutralizing the twins' influence at its source, even if it meant confronting Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe directly in their position of strength atop the courthouse clock tower. Torres checked his revolver and confirmed that he still had 4 shots remaining from his encounter at the laboratory. It wasn't much firepower against opponents who had demonstrated supernatural levels of planning and preparation, but it was all he had. "Doctor, I need you to stay here and document everything you see," Torres said, handing Fairfax his investigative notes and the evidence they had collected. "If I don't succeed in stopping them, someone needs to survive to warn the outside world about what the Crowe twins are capable of." Dr. Fairfax started to protest, but Torres cut him off. "This is my responsibility. I'm the law in Culpeper, and I failed to protect my community when it mattered most. I won't fail again." With that declaration, Sheriff William Torres began making his way through the geometrically arranged streets of his transformed hometown, moving from cover to cover as he approached the courthouse for what he knew would be his final confrontation with the monsters who had destroyed everything he had sworn to protect. Torres moved through the transformed streets of Culpeper with the stealth he had learned during his service in the Mexican-American War, using the unnaturally precise arrangements of furniture and belongings as cover while he approached the courthouse. The affected townspeople continued their mechanical work around him, so focused on their assigned tasks that they seemed unaware of his presence. Their blank expressions and synchronized movements created an atmosphere more unsettling than any battlefield he had experienced. As he drew closer to the courthouse, Torres could hear something that chilled him more than anything he had witnessed. During the investigation, the twins were speaking in unison from the clock tower, their voices carrying across the entire town with unnatural projection. They weren't shouting or straining to be heard, but somehow their words reached every corner of Colonel Pepper with perfect clarity. Citizens of our research community, the synchronized voices intoned, you have contributed magnificently to the advancement of human knowledge. Your willing participation in our studies has exceeded our most optimistic projections. Torres paused behind an overturned wagon and listened with growing dread as the twins addressed their captive audience. The data you have provided will enable us to expand our research to larger populations, ultimately achieving our goal of perfect social order through scientific management of human consciousness. You should feel pride in knowing that your community will be remembered as the birthplace of a new era in human civilization. The sheriff realized with horror that the twins were preparing to conclude their Culpeper project, which almost certainly meant eliminating all witnesses to their experiments. The 23 missing people had already been disposed of after serving their purpose in the research, and the remaining townspeople would likely suffer the same fate once their usefulness ended. Torres forced himself to continue toward the courthouse, climbing the external stairs that led to the tower, while the twins' voices continued their chilling address to the community below. Each step brought him closer to a confrontation he knew he was unlikely to survive, but also closer to the only chance Kohler had for salvation. Our methods have proven so successful, the twins continued, that we have already received correspondence from interested parties in Richmond, Baltimore, and Washington City. Government officials and academic institutions are eager to implement our techniques for managing difficult populations and ensuring social stability. The implications of this revelation struck Torres like a physical blow. The twins weren't just conducting isolated experiments. They were developing techniques that they planned to sell to the highest bidders, potentially giving corrupt officials and institutions the power to control entire populations through chemical manipulation. Torres reached the clock tower level and found himself face to face with Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe for the final time. Up close, their inhuman transformation was even more apparent. Their skin had taken on a waxy, preserved appearance, and their movements possessed the mechanical precision of clockwork rather than living flesh. Most disturbing of all, they showed no surprise at his arrival, as if they had been expecting him. "Sheriff Torres," they said in perfect unison, not bothering to turn from their observation of the town below, "you've arrived precisely on schedule. Your predictable behavior has been invaluable to our research." "It's over," Torres said, raising his revolver with hands steadier than he had expected. "I'm placing you both under arrest for the murders of 23 citizens of Culpeper County." The twins finally turned to face him, and Torres saw that their colorless eyes held no fear, no concern, no recognition of him as a threat. They looked at him with the same detached interest they had shown throughout the investigation, as if he were simply another specimen to be studied and catalogued. "You still don't understand," Ezekiel said with something that might have been pity in a normal human being. "We are beyond your primitive concepts of law and justice. We have transcended the limitations that constrain ordinary human consciousness." Nathaniel gestured toward the transformed town below them. "What you see as murder, we recognize as necessary research. What you call crime, we understand as scientific progress. Your moral framework is simply inadequate for comprehending the significance of our work." Torres felt rage building in his chest as he listened to the twins dismiss the lives of his friends and neighbors as insignificant research materials. "You're not scientists. You're monsters who torture and kill innocent people for your own twisted satisfaction." "Monsters," the twins repeated in unison, seeming to consider the word with academic interest. An interesting emotional response. "Tell us, Sheriff, what separates the procedures we conduct from those performed by physicians in medical colleges? What distinguishes our research from experiments conducted by military personnel developing new weapons?" "The difference," Torres said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice, "is that doctors try to save lives, and soldiers fight to protect innocent people. You torture and kill for entertainment disguised as science." The twins exchanged one of their synchronized glances, and Torres realized they were communicating through some method beyond normal speech. When they turned back to him, their expressions had shifted to something that might have been disappointment. "Your limited perspective prevents you from appreciating the broader implications of our work," Ezekiel said. "But you have served your purpose in our research. Your investigation provided valuable data about law enforcement responses to unexplained phenomena." Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a familiar glass vial filled with clear liquid. "Now you will contribute to our studies in a more direct manner. This refined version of our compliance compound will allow you to experience the liberation of absolute scientific objectivity." Torres realized that the twins intended to inject him with their chemical and force him to participate in whatever final experiment they had planned for Culpeper. But as Nathaniel stepped forward with the vial, Torres made his decision. Instead of trying to negotiate or reason with the inhuman creatures the twins had become, he did what his training and instincts told him was necessary. He pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across Culpeper like thunder, and Nathaniel staggered backward, with a look of genuine surprise on his face. Dark blood spread across his white shirt, but instead of collapsing, he looked down at the wound with scientific curiosity. "Fascinating," he said, his voice slightly weaker, but still unnaturally calm. "The physiological response to projectile trauma is exactly as documented in our research." Ezekiel showed no emotional reaction to his brother's injury, but instead began taking notes in his journal with mechanical precision. Wound placement suggests damage to major organs. Blood loss rate indicates subject will achieve termination within approximately 15 minutes. Torres fired again, this time hitting Ezekiel in the chest. The second twin's response was identical to his brother's. Surprise, followed by clinical interest in his own injury. Neither brother showed fear, pain, or any normal human response to mortal wounds. "Sheriff," they said in unison, their voices beginning to weaken, but still maintaining perfect synchronization. "You have provided us with excellent final data. The psychological profile of law enforcement personnel under extreme stress is now complete." As the twins slowly collapsed to the floor of the clock tower, Torres heard something that filled him with hope. The sounds of confusion and distress from the townspeople below. The mechanical precision of their movements was breaking down, replaced by the natural chaos of people awakening from a nightmare. They couldn't quite remember. Dr. Fairfax's theory had been correct. With the twins' death, their chemical influence over the community was rapidly wearing off, allowing the surviving residents to regain their individual consciousness and free will. Torres looked down at the dying twins and felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion and grief for the community that had been lost. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you do this to innocent people?" With their final breaths, Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe provided an answer that would haunt Torres for the rest of his life. "Because we could. Because human beings are simply resources to be utilized by those with superior knowledge and capabilities. Because the advancement of science justifies any sacrifice." The twins died as they had lived since their return to Culp Peppa in perfect synchronization, their final exhalation occurring at exactly the same moment, but even in death, their pale eyes remained open, staring sightlessly at the summer sky, with the same cold detachment they had shown toward every human life they had destroyed. In the weeks that followed the twins' death, the true scope of their impact on Kulp Peppa became clear. Of the original 800 residents, only 347 survived the summer of 1847. The 23 people who had disappeared in the early stages of her investigation were never found, despite extensive searches of the forest laboratory and surrounding areas. Their fate remained a mystery that would haunt the survivors for generations. The remaining townspeople, freed from the twins' chemical influence, struggled with fragmented memories of their time under control. Most remembered participating in the geometric arrangements that had transformed their community, but couldn't explain why such activities had seemed important or necessary. Dr. Fairfax documented these cases extensively, creating what would become one of the first clinical studies of mass psychological manipulation in American medical literature. Sheriff Torres compiled a comprehensive report of the investigation, including detailed documentation of the twins' methods, their laboratory discoveries, and the implications of their research for public safety. However, when he attempted to submit this report to state and federal authorities, he encountered resistance that suggested the twins' claims about government interest in their work had not been entirely fabricated. The Virginia State Police classified Torres's report as a local matter and declined to investigate further. Federal marshals who arrived in Kulp Peppa to assess the situation confiscated most of the physical evidence, including the twins' laboratory equipment, research notes, and chemical compounds. The official finding was that Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe had been mentally disturbed individuals who had conducted isolated criminal acts with no broader implications for public security. Dr. Fairfax attempted to publish his medical observations about mass psychological manipulation in several professional journals, but his submissions were rejected as unverifiable anecdotal reports that lacked scientific rigor. The medical establishment of 1847 was simply not prepared to accept evidence of chemical techniques for controlling human behavior, despite the extensive documentation Fairfax had compiled by the end of 1847. Most official records of the Culpa incident had been sealed, lost, or destroyed. The courthouse fire of 1851 eliminated any remaining local documentation, and the federal files were buried so deeply in Washington archives that they effectively ceased to exist. The surviving residents of Culpeper were left to rebuild their community with the knowledge that their government had chosen to suppress rather than investigate one of the most significant threats to public safety in the nation's history. Many families left the area entirely, unable to remain in a place that held such traumatic memories. Those who stayed rarely spoke about the summer of 1847, even among themselves. Sheriff Torres continued to serve Culpeper until his death in 1863, but he never fully recovered from his failure to protect the community he had sworn to serve. His private journals discovered after his death revealed that he spent the remainder of his career searching for evidence of similar incidents in other communities. Convinced that the Crowe twins' techniques had been adopted and refined by other individuals or organizations, Dr. Fairfax left Kolar in 1849 to pursue advanced medical training in Europe, hoping to find academic environments more receptive to research into psychological manipulation and chemical behavior modification. His later work in Vienna and Paris contributed to early developments in psychiatry and neurochemistry, though he never publicly connected his research to his experiences. In Culpeper, the twins' forest laboratory was destroyed by a mysterious fire just days after Torres's confrontation at the courthouse. When investigators reached the site, they found only ash and melted glass, with no trace of the sophisticated equipment or preserved specimens that had been documented by the search party. The fire appeared to have burned at temperatures far exceeding what natural combustion could achieve, suggesting that someone had taken deliberate steps to eliminate all evidence of the twins' work. Local folklore in Kulp Peppa County maintains that the twins' influence didn't entirely end with their deaths. Residents occasionally report finding geometric arrangements of natural objects in the forests around town, stones, branches, or flowers placed in patterns reminiscent of the twins' designs. These discoveries are usually attributed to coincidence or the tendency of traumatized communities to see meaningful patterns in random events. However, Dr. Fairfax's European research eventually led him to correspond with colleagues who reported similar incidents in other locations, isolated communities where residents had displayed temporary episodes of coordinated behavior, unexplained disappearances that followed geometric patterns, and reports of individuals with unusual knowledge of chemical compounds and psychological manipulation technique. These reports suggested that the Crowe twins might not have been unique in their capabilities, but rather part of a larger network of individuals conducting similar research in remote locations throughout the United States and Europe. If such a network existed, it would explain how two young men from rural Virginia had acquired sophisticated knowledge of chemistry, psychology, and experimental techniques that exceeded the capabilities of major universities. The truth about Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crowe, their training, their methods, and their ultimate objectives, died with them in the Culpeper courthouse clock tower. But the questions their brief reign of terror raised about the vulnerability of human consciousness to scientific manipulation, the willingness of authorities to suppress evidence of threats to public safety, and the potential for individuals to acquire and misuse advanced knowledge continued to resonate more than 175 years after that terrible summer. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? The fact that official records were suppressed and evidence was destroyed means we may never know the complete truth about what happened in Culpeper County during the summer of 1847. Leave your comment below about whether you think the twins were working alone or as part of something larger. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. The truth about America's darkest secrets is waiting to be discovered. And there are many more stories like this one, hidden in the shadows of our nation's past. See you in the next video.